In 2014 and 2022, the EU initiated sanctions regimes against Russia. The lists of entities and individuals were originally supposed to target Russia's economic and political elites only. But since 2024, the list has been expanded to include disinformation and is being used to target journalists and academics, even in EU and Schengen area states, like the German nationals Alina Lipp and Hüseyin Dogru, or my countrymen, Jacques Baud and Nathalie Yamb. It's a dystopian reality, but certainly not the first time something like this happens. To discuss the historical precedents, I'm joined today again by Professor David Gibbs, a professor of history at Arizona State University. David, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for taking the time to do this, because you have actually looked at McCarthyism and you have something to tell us about that one and the parallels that you're seeing between what happened in the United States in the 50s and 60s about the Red Scare and where the European Union is at today. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, yes, I think that what you have in McCarthyism, I would say, is a kind of a distinctively American variant of repression, of political repression, and that in America, we do have very strong constitutional protections of civil liberties. The First Amendment guarantees freedom of speech and freedom of the press. The Fifth Amendment guarantees due process of law. And the Constitution has a particularly high status because it's kind of a revered document in American political culture, seen almost as like
Mythical.
Mythical or even religious. And so evangelical Christians look at it almost like the Bible. And so it really has enormous influence. And there's been some restrictions of the ability to throw people in prison because they don't like their political views. That happens too in America. But it's relatively the exception. I think McCarthyism, I would define broadly as being a distinctive form of repression that involves intimidation and threats to your career or your reputation combined with mass surveillance. And this is its origins. I know you're in the Philippines now, so the origins of this actually is in the Philippines, actually, and in the American Empire in the Philippines after the conquest in 1898. Well, I mean, before I discuss the deep history, I just want to note that you are definitely getting a resurgence of McCarthyism now with a constant obsession with Russia, basically Russian disinformation, and constantly accusing people of being Russian dupes or Russian agents or Russian, agents of disinformation, damaging their reputation in a way that's almost irrefutable. Because how do you prove you're not a Russian agent? You can't do that. So the enormous damage done to your reputation and your credibility by merely accusing you of this, however falsely, is very effective, and it's being used widely, both in Europe and in the United States. And again, this is one of America's distinctive contributions to world history, is this new technique of McCarthyism, of use of intimidation and essentially forms of defamation as the main method through which basically disturbing or threatening viewpoints are being dealt with. Again, one way of dealing with viewpoints you don't like is refute them, show they're wrong, give evidence they're wrong. You can argue back and forth. There's accountability there. But the whole idea in McCarthyism is to evade accountability and just do it through subtle means, basically, that are essentially irrefutable and not susceptible to logic or evidence.
Yeah, so basic repression, and that then leads straight into basically the criminalization. Although we need to be careful here, because the legal aspects of something criminal and what is actually going on in the EU and what McCarthyism is are separate concepts.
Right.
But just to make it clear, like, so you're saying also in the United States at the moment there's a climate of repression, although probably massive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there are two things. First of all, it must be said, Trump is using, shall we say, old-fashioned pre-McCarthyite techniques of repression, just sort of rounding people up and throwing them out of the country because you don't like their political views or just don't like them generally. That's being done. That's completely unconstitutional. I'm amazed he's been getting away with it. When the Fifth Amendment, by the way, says nobody shall be deprived of due process of law, it doesn't restrict that to citizens. All right.
Yeah, I mean, he establishes that in the way that he interprets the Constitution. He says the Constitution only applies to U.S. citizens, period. So everybody else stays at the gates. No, but
the Constitution doesn't say that.
Do we already have a verdict on this by the Supreme Court? Because actually these cases should be taken to the Supreme Court, right?
It should be, yes. It tends to take a long time to wind its way through the court system. They should really expedite something like this, but they haven't, at least not fully. So at some point, I'm sure it'll be declared unconstitutional, but that could take some time. And so that's one aspect. But another aspect that I think is much more pure McCarthyism is the way the Democrats are acting, which is accusing anybody. This is both parties, but it's mostly the Democrats are basically accusing anybody who dissents on any aspect of the um, the Russian threat as they see it. Anybody who dissents on any aspect of the U.S. aid to Ukraine is a Russian agent. Um, and the Democrats have also used that, I think, against Donald Trump, ironically, and constantly have been accusing him of being a Russian agent. That was for all along. I mean, in 2016, basically, when Hillary Clinton debated Donald Trump, she said, "You're a puppet of Putin." That's pure McCarthyism. That's 100% McCarthyism. It's also obviously false because everything Trump has done has been very, or not everything, most of what he's done has been very harmful to Russia. So the idea that he's a puppet of Putin is manifestly false, but the Democrats still cling to that. There's a very popular television show host. I think she's not really that well known in Europe or Asia, but widely viewed here. Her name is Rachel Maddow. And she constantly talks 24 hours a day, it would seem, about the Russian threat and if Donald Trump is an agent of Russia. Again, that's McCarthyism. And so you have McCarthyism going, it's everywhere now. And evidently it's in Europe as well. I'd like to say, I mean, at first, in law, there's the idea of equipoise, that basically both sides basically have, neither side comes off looking very good here. Let's put it that way. Both are committed to use of repression, essentially non-democratic means to get their way. And that includes basically opponents of Trump who are using this McCarthyite cudgel as a way of structuring debate and sort of blocking any real serious adult discussion of what's going on in Ukraine right now. Oh, I should know also, by the way, very important, that's happening widely with regard to the Middle East.
Yeah.
Anybody who criticizes Israel faces major threats of being kicked out of school or being, losing their job. I mean, that's being done at a wide scale.
But if you accuse Donald Trump of being a puppet of Netanyahu, then you are out of polite discourse and you will be called an anti-Semite. And this is
anti-Semitism charge. Yeah,
it's quite amazing, that when actual foreign leaders have influence, not control, but there clearly is influence, there clearly is a lobby. Then that one is exempt from McCarthyite accusations, right? The real McCarthyism is always about a boogeyman, about something that's clearly not going on. It's
a boogeyman. That's right. The whole idea of McCarthyism is basically wild exaggerations or fabrications about a boogeyman. And, so clearly Putin has been reduced to a boogeyman. And anti-Semitism is being used in the most frivolous and preposterous ways. Being Jewish in no way guarantees that you're not going to be accused of that. That's not a shield at all. A lot of the demonstrators on campus against Israel's policies in Gaza have been Jewish, and that hasn't protected them from retaliation.
What fascinates me, I mean, in the negative sense, right, that I really hate that this is happening, is that all of this is so well understood. I remember 20 years ago in my English classes in high school, we read this wonderful book. The title was The Crucible. I think it's from a guy called Miller, right? It's a very famous book written during McCarthyism, the first McCarthyism in the 60s, about the witch hunts in Salem of the 1690s or around thereabout, right?
Yeah. I know exactly, 1600s, yeah.
And this is so well documented and understood, and the processes are the same, and now it's repeating again. It's like, it's 400 years, 500 years of the same mechanisms of designating some groups of people as boogeymen, and then as agents of Satan. The witches are agents of Satan, right? In the 60s, they were agents of the Soviets, and now they're agents of Putin. It's exactly, it works in the same psychological way, but and it's, even though we teach this stuff at universities and schools and so on, we're not getting out of it.
What you're getting also is an ideological switcheroo, or as George Galloway put it, a kind of political cross-dressing, in which basically McCarthyism had been confined pretty much to the political right, mostly the Republican Party. And now it seems to be more common in the Democratic Party. And even much of the activist left is falling into line here and are constantly I have friends basically who are lefty friends, and they condemn McCarthyism, and they'll talk about how horrible McCarthyism is. And yeah, but Donald Trump clearly is working for Russia. Um, and they don't realize how, you know, there was a group called the John Birch Society, which after McCarthy fell from favor, it was kind of an extreme right-wing group funded by, I think, industrialist oil men in Texas. I think there was a lot of business support, but in the extreme ultra right, it was considered fringe. It was very conspiracy minded and accused everybody of being a communist and an agent of Russia. So much of what the Democratic Party is saying today is almost exactly what the John Birch Society was saying in an earlier period during the Cold War. And they don't even realize how discrediting that is to them and how strong the parallel is. Now we have a revival of what had been extreme right conspiracy theorizing now emerging on the political left, both in the Democratic Party and the activist left in the United States. I find that extraordinary, astonishing, really. And it's happening in Europe too, including the mainstream left, the Socialist Party of France, I gather, is fully behind this. The Labour Party of Britain is completely behind this. The Social Democrats in Germany. Um, and so, am I wrong about that? You know the European situation better than I do, I think.
No, no, you're right about that. Although I would qualify it by saying that in labor, it took quite a bit of purges in order to get to a point where they supported. I mean, you had the Corbynites, right? And they were
That's right.
they were completely exiled. But that was successful. That purge was successful, and now the labor is sternly behind all of this anti-Russian and I mean, a McCarthyite approach to also controlling society. Because the whole point is you need to keep your own society clean out of these subversive counter narratives to what is happening. And it seems to me that the more the war is being lost in Ukraine, the worse things get, and the more reality asserts itself, the harder the crackdown now becomes. Do you have any parallels about this also to McCarthyism?
McCarthyism was different in that respect, in the sense that anti-communism was firmly in the saddle at the time of the early 50s. There wasn't really, I mean, Truman was extremely unpopular, but the anti-communist idea was completely hegemonic, and it was true in both parties. What you're having in Europe is desperation, reflected in a number of things. First of all, that I think anybody who looks carefully can see that Russia's going to win the war, and there's no way around that at this point. And I think that people are figuring that out and getting desperate. But something else that they're getting desperate about is the unpopularity of the major leaders of Europe is almost historically unprecedented. I mean, in the most extreme cases, Macron, who recently a poll put him at, I think, 11%. 11% of the French people support their president. That's incredible. Starmer is not far behind, and Merz is not far behind either. They're well on the way to being in Macron land, which is universally despised by their own people. And so I think that gives them a certain desperation, and are so heavily committed to this war, they feel they can't back out now. I mean, imagine they spent hundreds of billions of dollars on the war. They've lowered living standards. In Germany, they've begun deindustrializing the country in a way that's probably irreversible. And then you lose the war. How does that look? Not great. Not great. And so I think now there's a certain desperation and a need to use heavy-handed methods, legally, certainly profoundly undemocratic methods, because they don't know what else to do. At least that's the way it looks to me. In the case of the United States, I think the Democratic Party is still in a case of disbelief that Trump won. It's really amazing. Trump has been dominating American politics for a decade now, fully a decade.
Yeah.
And the Democrats don't have a clue as to what went wrong. Not a clue. And they certainly didn't do anything wrong. They haven't changed anything. You think that a kind of a failure like they experienced in 2016, and then again recently, would result in a house cleaning and a loss of confidence in leadership, but nothing like that happened. There was no soul searching about what did we do wrong, nothing like that. Instead, it's a boogeyman. It's all Putin's fault. Putin engineered the whole thing. That's why we have this problem now. And so I think that there's certain desperation by the Democrats and by much of the political establishment, which still, most of it has not reconciled itself to the idea that there's no going back to what it was like pre-Trump. Trump has transformed American politics, mostly in an ugly way, but transformed it all the same. And I think in the desperation, it's amazing highly educated people talking like this, but that's exactly what's happening. They're saying it's all due to Putin. That's why. I hear that all the time.
Really, because I mean, in Japan, where I am, that it's not that huge a topic, right? These discussions of what is driving the war. So I'm not that much exposed to this form of like faculty talk, let's say. But where how do we make sense of that because like there are important arguments from some analysts, including most importantly probably Brian Beletic, who says like, look, this is all part of how the United States as a system works. It's the uniparty. You have different flavors of the same direction or different lanes of the same direction, but it is the same direction, and it's a direction that's geared toward maintaining constant warfare. For one reason or another, but it is warfare where things are going. And at the moment, it could be that the war is being expanded from Ukraine into Europe. So gearing up Europe and making Europe ready and massaging it in, that the war is inevitable with Russia. And if you listen to the Europeans, that's what it sounds like from their mouths. They're actually saying, we must get ready. Some NATO commander the other day said, preemptive strikes against Russia are now should be considered defensive in nature.
Incredible.
It's getting insane. It's like the drum beats, and the people in Brussels are still cheering this on. They're saying, yes, that's what we need to do. We need to get ready. I mean, the Germans now speak about Kriegstüchtigkeit, being ready for war, being ability to do war. This would have been unthinkable even just 4 years ago, because it's so reminiscent of the darkest times of Germany of the last century, right?
I think also, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I mean, I was going to say that what I do remember, I mean, I've been around for a while. I do remember during the Cold War and even during the 90s, we Americans those of us who could read foreign languages, we'd try and get our hands into European newspapers. I read French, I would read Le Monde, I'd read the British press. It was much better than the American press because they report all sorts of things you wouldn't see in the American press. It was much more critical of U.S. policy. It reported a range of things going on. I remember during the reign of the Shah in the 70s, if you wanted to read basically about how unpopular the Shah was, about how he used torture against his own people, you had to read Le Monde because that's what was being reported. Not true anymore. I mean, the European press is terrible now. It's at least as bad, if not worse, than the American press.
The European press is now downstream New York Times. I mean, they get the New York Times every morning, and then they write what these articles say. It's all downstream. Switzerland sends it, and so on. It's very well integrated now. But one of the things I remember about McCarthyism, and one of the main charges of this novel and the play, it's actually a stage play, The Crucible, is that it's essentially a mass psychosis. Of course, there are no witches, right? Of course, there are no people who do sorcery and are connected to the devil. But once everybody starts believing it, you start hanging people, right? Literally, in doing the witch hunts. So it's a mass psychosis that then spreads and spreads and spreads. Did we see that during McCarthyism, and at what point did that run itself out?
Well, a little bit. I mean, if I don't mind, I'll go a little bit of history here. The history, the beginning, it really is in the Philippines, and it began with U.S. colonialism, conquest of the Philippines, and after mass pacification, I think we killed about 200,000 Filipinos in the process. By the early 20th century, the United States, consistent with its democratic traditions, I guess, or what it thought it were its democratic traditions, began sort of allowing some degree of political organization and political activity by the Filipinos themselves, I guess in preparation for a distant eventual independence, which I think came in 46. And at the same time, I'm sorry, do you want to answer?
May I add? Just because I listened to a wonderful talk by a Filipino colleague who actually proved that this allowing for political self-determination went hand in hand with the debates about the yellow peril in the United States, because Filipinos started immigrating into the United States. The yellow peril didn't refer to China or Japan in the beginning. It referred to the Filipino immigrants into the US, because suddenly there were so many. So it's like, okay, let's keep them over there. And well, I mean,
right. Yeah, no, that's true. That was is a tremendously anti-immigrant element here, especially Asians, based on racist considerations. But in any case, at the same time as you had this, allowing for political openness in the Philippines, U.S. Army intelligence began this mass surveillance project, and it was the brainchild of an obscure figure named Ralph Van Damon, who was a mid-ranking officer, later achieved the rank of major general, later became a major advisor to McCarthyism in the United States. But he was a very talented figure. I don't like to make value judgments, such as how cheap to do, but I'll do so here. He's one of these people who used all of his talents to make the world a worse place.
Mm.
And what he did is he established a series of, they didn't have computers in those days. So what he did is he used index cards, like they were beginning to use in libraries at the time to catalog books, and would start compiling surveillance information about the Filipino elite being defined very broadly, anybody basically who maybe had, secondary school education, and began finding whatever compromising information he could about them in terms of their sex life or their financial activities, and began blackmailing them. And then in terms of blackmailing them, he would ask them for other names, other incriminating information about their friends, thus increasing the list. And he had a huge list of thousands and thousands and thousands. And he just went on and on and on. And it became a bit of a cancerous thing in that different factions of the US military intelligence who didn't like each other would start keeping book on each other and using this technique against each other. And then basically when he went back to the United States, the bottom line is it was a little bit like, if you looked at it superficially, it looked like the US was democratizing the country. But behind the scenes, Army intelligence was pulling the strings, you might say, through intimidation and blackmail. And that's the origins of modern McCarthyism right there. And he went back. I'm sorry, do you want to add something to that?
No, it's just fascinating, right? If you want to pretend to have a democracy but still call the shots, then I guess this is what you have to do. You need to be sure that the people who are not on board are somewhere else and tucked away in a list.
Exactly. You have to have the pretense of democracy or the forms of democracy, but make sure that people say the right thing. And they better say the right thing if you want to, you have information on them. And so it also indicates if you can't have an empire and a democracy at the same time, because Ralph Van Damen went home to the United States, and then he was a bitterly sort of reactionary figure, anti-leftist, anti-communist, and so on. He began compiling information on leftists in the United States. He came back, I believe, shortly before World War I, and he began working with after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the Justice Department, at the direction of President Wilson, began rounding up radicals of all sorts, basically, not just communists, but anybody who was a radical. Eugene V. Debs, head of the Socialist Party, it was a major public figure. He received like 1 million votes in the last election. He was arrested for no reason other than they opposed the war. And he was put in prison for 2.5 years. He actually ran for president in 1920 from his prison cell and won 1 million votes from his prison cell. And the person who was really in charge of this was the 24-year-old figure named J. Edgar Hoover, who basically was put in charge of the Bureau of Investigation, later the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and sort of supercharged it. And the person who was helping him was Ralph Van Damen, who basically turned over his whole idea of using index cards to compile information. People are organizing them elaborately. This was easy for J. Edgar Hoover because in high school, he'd worked at the Library of Congress, which was indexing its books. And so he understood the idea. And so he began compiling. And so you began getting sort of, you might say, it's an extra constitutional arrest. All these arrests were unconstitutional, later declared unconstitutional. If you can't arrest people, based on speech. That's illegal under the First Amendment to the Constitution, but they did it anyway. Later on, it was declared unconstitutional. And so J. Edgar Hoover was painstakingly compiling files on everybody. All right. And he began doing this. He was particularly obsessed with people's sexual lives. He was very likely himself a closeted homosexual who hated homosexuality almost as much as he hated communism and socialism. And he loved compiling information on people's sex lives. And not only men, but also women. There was a general strike called in Seattle that was sort of very radical in character. The way he broke it was that the wife of the person leading it was having an affair, and he basically blackmailed her. I'll destroy your reputation unless you give me all the information I want, and use that to break the strike. And so intimidation was how it was done. And that became really Joseph McCarthy was almost like a secondary figure in this. It was J. Edgar Hoover and Ralph Van Damon who were really at the heart of what became McCarthyism. In any case, when World War II was over, the FBI had grown to this enormous organization fighting German spies, and J. Edgar Hoover was very reluctant to let go of the tremendous number of agents and funding he got. And so he was eagerly climbed aboard the anti-communist effort. And he began compiling information on communists and then began turning on communists. Presidents were terrified of him, by the way, because it's widely believed that he had damaging information on every president. And so presidents didn't want to interfere with his activities. And private
it wasn't Epstein that invented the the idea of lists of dirt on people. Sorry, this is just a side note.
Well, Epstein, I mean, one of the reasons I think people are suspicious of Epstein, let me say, I don't know very much about Epstein. I have no idea if he worked for intelligence or not. But one of the reasons I think that people are suspicious of him possibly working for Mossad or the CIA or MI6 or all three, who knows, is it does look like he operated a lot the way intelligence officers do, which is basically you provide attractive women, in this case, girls, underage girls, have them have famous people have sex with them. Then you photograph them doing it, so you can blackmail them afterwards. That's classic intelligence technique. But in any case, the American left was very powerful after World War II. This is really the only time, really, the left really had real power. And I think one of the reasons you had the Cold War, not the only one, but one of them, was it provided an excuse and justification to smash and destroy the left, which they did. The Communist Party was very popular. There are other parties too. And the whole idea is basically J. Edgar Hoover helped destroy them. He destroyed them through the classic method, which is he acquired information on them. He got them fired from their jobs for any kind of leftist activity. And of course, it metastasized. And as it metastasized, he began using it against not only leftists, but people he didn't like in the administration. He began in the Truman administration. He began claiming the Truman administration was filled with communists. And he began intimidating Dean Acheson's, one of the architects of the Cold War and the anti-communist policy. Then came along Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy was elected senator from Wisconsin in 1946. He had no significant record of legislation. He had no real interest in anti-communism, actually. The way it began is in 1950, he was facing re-election. He had no record. And so he met with a series of friends he had who were professors at Georgetown University. It's a very conservative Catholic university. He was Catholic. And I attended Georgetown, by the way, so I remember it was very, very right-wing. And it, a bit creepy, actually. And it, and he had, was having dinner with his friends at Georgetown and said that, I don't really have an issue. What can you guys give me an issue? And they suggested anti-communism and basically say, the government's filled with communists. There were spies, there were Soviet spies during World War II, but they'd been all cleaned out and prosecuted and so on. And by 1950, there was nobody left. And so he began saying, the major institutions, the State Department is filled with communists. Then the Army was filled with, the CIA privately considered saying we had all sorts of communists and so on. And major architects of the Cold War were accused of being communists, as I said. And he, went around denouncing them. He made it all up. And so in private, he admitted he made it all up. He began changing, he'd been, saying, I have in my hand a list of communists in the State Department. He kept changing the number of communists randomly. Just forgot what the real vast number was. Biographies of him note that he was just known to be just randomly make things up constantly, but had the effect of mass intimidation. It affected, not only did it affect government, but it also affected, academia was purged, Hollywood was purged of scriptwriters, journalism was purged. There were purges going on all over the place. And it transformed American politics. You look at the 1950s, it was a quiet decade where people were afraid to say anything. It was a boring decade in a lot of ways because dissent was almost illegal. It wasn't illegal technically, but again, if you were dissented, you could be called a communist. And you'd lose your job, you'd lose your reputation. That was the end of that. But it's worth, there's a very interesting TV series that was on in the 1950s, the original Twilight Zone with Rod Serling. And it's interesting because Rod Serling was somebody who really wanted to make TV a launching point to have serious discussions about serious issues like war and peace. He'd seen heavy combat in the Pacific. He was very anti-war. He was very concerned about nuclear war. He was worried about lynching of black people in the South. And he couldn't discuss these things because repression. You couldn't discuss anything seriously because you had to keep your mouth shut. So what he did instead, it was very clever. If you watch it, it's very clever. He had stories about aliens from outer space and monsters and ghosts and goblins, and it was always metaphor for serious political issues. All right, often McCarthyism was being discussed in this context.
Is that the guy with his signature last line, good night and good luck?
No, that's Morrow. That's Morrow. He was a journalist. No, Serling basically was somebody else, but it is worth watching as sort of a documentation of culture in an era of repression, which is what the 1950s was.
Yeah, you know, the thing that strikes me is that we see these patterns like time and again. So if we take that one as a pattern, then actually what we're seeing in Europe right now is probably only the beginning. It's probably an early stage because the Putinists are currently located within far and few between in a civil society, right? And you got to take them out, Jacques Baud and Yamb and so on, and for basically anything. It has nothing to do with Putin, especially Nathalie Yamb. She's an African, you know, an anti-neocolonialist, and we've got others of those. But you now take this, you weaponize it, you use it against these people, and you ride the mass hysteria wave, and while you foster it. And then the next stage would then be to say like, oh, we have got more of them than we thought. They're also within the administration. They're also within the military. We need to do the purges, right? We need, so it will blow, it will go, it metastasizes. And in a sense, you know, I mean, even the French Revolution at the end started like cracking down on their own people, right? And their own children, right? It's kind of the way that these, I still don't know if I should conceptualize it as a mass psychosis or as a tool of power and you know, dominance, or probably it's both at the same time.
I'd say it's both. Yeah, it's both. I think one of the problems we do have in Europe and the United States as well, I should add, is that there was a tremendous need to use propaganda to sell the war. Problem is, I think elites began to believe their own propaganda. I think that's what's going on here. That's what I'm seeing. It does seem to be almost kind of a religious zeal that I'm seeing here among people who really ought to know better. I do think that one of the things, I think the next shoe to drop could be if we have a recession. Yeah. Things could get very ugly in the streets, especially in a place like France, which has a long tradition of sort of street riots against policies, basically, that are bad for living standards. And so if there's a downturn in the economy, I would expect basically, you know, politics would move from the parliaments to the streets very quickly, especially when you have people who have no public credibility. I mean, I should add, by the way, in general, there's always been a lot of popular resentment in Europe against the European Commission as a basically fundamentally undemocratic institution. It's always been an undemocratic institution. Here it is, you know, cracking down on people as basically witches, you know, and I suspect in due course, this could cause a lot of social disorder.
Yeah, you know, this is probably the only one of the few places where I don't completely understand that charge, because, you know, the commission is elected or selected, is elected in the same way that any kind of government in a parliamentary democracy is elected, right? It's elected by the people who get elected to parliament. So right. The parliamentarians then choose the head of the government, right? And that's very common in Europe. So that's basically the only point where I would say the charge of not being elected is maybe a bit overblown, although it is true that they didn't stand for popular election, but that's just not how Europe works, and it doesn't make it less democratic, I think. But of course, the problem is that these people are then cracking down very, very hard on individuals and make these like dystopian kind of policies. And actually what we're seeing is a power grab by the European Union, power away from the member states into the hands of Brussels, without due process, by people who are put there through these parliamentarians who have support of like about 35% of Europeans bother to vote in EU elections. So there is a deficit, definitely. But please.
Well, that's what I'm seeing is basically that there may very well be. I mean, thank you for correcting me on the European tradition is different on this. I understand. Nevertheless, my sense is so on the political fringes, you're getting kind of a populist resentment. I mean, they had it
Yeah.
in Britain, Brexit in Britain. I mean, there's a populist resentment against the EU. I think for a number of reasons. One is just nationalism, but also it's seen as an instrument of neoliberalism, which it is. Um, and I think now also it's an instrument of war. And so you have people like Merz openly talking about we have to lower living standards. It's going to come from living standards. You have, Macron talking about, we have to, raise the retirement age. And it's these things are not popular. They've never been popular, and they shouldn't be popular. Why would people consent to having their living standards lowered? Um, and so I think that basically they're really playing with fire here. And I think there's a realization they're playing with fire here. And I think that's why you're getting a certain desperation on their part, resorting to these extraordinary measures that we're talking about here today. So that's how I would see it.
How about the parallels to this extra legal nature of what's happening? Because in the EU, these sanctions are clearly, even by the European Commission, uh, they're not framed as legal measures. They're framed not as punishments. The EU says on its homepage, where it explains the sanctions, these are not punitive. They are meant as a tool of education to correct behavior of the sanctioned people. So it's that's why it's not a legal action. It's an educational. No, the what's the word?
Educational. Sounds
Disciplinary.
totalitarian.
It's a disciplinary action because these people didn't do anything illegal. They didn't. Everything they do is perfectly fine, fair, and square. But it now results in something that is a severe punishment while not being framed as such. That's why I think these cases have to be thrown out by the European Court of Justice. But of course, you inverse the logic, right? It's not innocent until proven guilty. It's like guilty until they manage to prove their innocence. And proving innocence is extremely difficult because as soon as the commission alters one word in the little description in that stupid database, the case will have to start anew because the European Court of Justice will consider it a new reason for the sanctions. So, I mean, you just make this very, very horrible bureaucratic monster that then cracks down on individuals. Do we have parallels to that in McCarthyism?
Well, I was going to say that, what you're describing there, I have to, the bizarre kind of situation you're describing there, it would be difficult to do that in the United States, and the American situation would be different. The reason is, once again, the Fifth Amendment gives robust protections against that sort of thing. It'd be very difficult. It's not impossible, it's been done, but it'll be much more difficult to do in the American context, given the strong reverence of the Constitution in the United States. And a much more typical way it would be done, if it were to happen here, I would guess, would be something like this. These people would there'd be a massive campaign, public campaign to denounce them as agents of Putin. You'd start seeing stories in the press of how the rumors of a secret bank account where they're getting money from Putin, even without any proof, of course. And that's how it would be done. And the reputations would be damaged. There would also be efforts basically to have the intelligence services work with the internet companies to sort of remove them or restrict them on social media. That's been done as well in this country. In other words, the government can't itself remove things from the internet, but it can pressure and work closely with internet companies and advise them what to do, and then they will do it for them. The constitutionality of that is open to question, but I don't think the courts have yet blocked it because it's not the government that's doing it, it's the private sector that's doing it, you see. And so I think there are roundabout ways they would do it in the United States, but I think the sort of extreme heavy-handedness you're describing that's unlikely to happen here.
Okay, I mean that's really one of the huge benefits of the U.S. Constitution that some of its fundamentals are actually written into it. The problem then, of course, in the U.S. case is always like who does it apply to, right? And it's I mean the entire problem with I mean slavery was only abolished after the Civil War, 64, right? I mean, so you had this whole stretch of time when it was believed that this group doesn't actually belong to those who the Constitution applies, but it's a question of applicability. For the Europeans, that's not the issue. It's like there are no such fundamental legal constitutional safeguards. There is the jargon about it. But the people who are using the jargon are now those who are doing the cracking down. It's really quite extraordinary to me.
Well, I think what you're getting in Europe is a very clear case of the national security threat they're facing from Russia is so extreme. The imminence of war is so clear that we can't have fifth colonists, and we have fifth colonists here. We have to take extraordinary measures. Extraordinary times require extraordinary measures. I suppose that's how they would justify it to themselves. To some extent, I think that's probably how they justify it publicly, I would think.
Probably, but I mean, if you look at the concrete cases, Nathalie Yamb or Hüseyin Dogru. Hüseyin Dogru it's very clear. He's sanctioned for his advocacy for for the Palestinian cause, and Nathalie Yamb for French anti-neocolonialism. And it is utterly clear the people who put them there must very consciously understand that what they're doing is just finding an excuse to punish people. So the people doing it are probably not under this mass psychosis, but the general public that then goes like, actually not bad. And we see that in Switzerland too, where people are now discussing whether the risk of our most outspoken publicist, his name is Roger Köppel, he's running the Weltwoche magazine. Last week it was discussed whether he is running the danger of being sanctioned by the EU. And you see these comments by other journalists in Switzerland and Germany who say like, would serve him right because he's such a Putin apologist.
Well, I think that's the
discourse, right? It becomes sayable, it becomes discussable, and therefore it's kind of real in the social world.
That's where you get the McCarthyism coming in, because it's intimidation, it's instructional, shall we say. And that people say, if they did it to Jacques Baud, well, what's to stop them from doing it to me, right? And if you value your career, you value the paycheck you get from your career, especially if you have a family, that may be very compelling. The journalist Weltwoche, I guess, the one you mentioned, he probably doesn't want to lose his job, which I assume is a possibility under the circumstances.
He's one of the owner. I mean, he's the owner of the entire magazine, so he has some sort of protection, and he's outspoken. He's like Switzerland's. Imagine him a bit like Switzerland's. What's his name?
Seymour Hersh?
No, the U.S. Tucker Carlson. It's like the Swiss Tucker Carlson. So that type of personality. So he certainly won't shut up. It just makes his point that the EU is a draconian monster, right? He's also a former parliamentarian, actually, in Switzerland. But point still is, it flows into each other, doesn't it? Like this punishment regime and then the kind of semi-public acceptability of it. Even if just 20-30% think this is fine and 70% reject it, you will have a public discourse about it, and therefore it becomes part of just how how society works. And I don't know if there are references also to the Soviet Union, where the repressive mechanisms were very clearly understood, weren't they?
Well, they were. Obviously, a lot of what you're describing is very totalitarian that's going on here. And I think one of the things you do have that's been useful from the standpoint of European and American elites is that what they've done in Ukraine, the whole Ukraine war, just in purely technical terms, has been, from the Western standpoint, incompetent, in that they started a war they couldn't win. Now they're losing it. They don't know what to do. They're incompetent. Except for one thing, they've run the propaganda campaign extremely well, I'll have to say. That was done with great competence, very, very well. And the public has mostly been brought on board on this, as you've noted. Yeah. And clearly, if there's this terrible national security threat, totally unprovoked by the West, of course, then you can't have fifth columnists, people who are threats to the national security. And so it creates this sort of paranoia, this internal paranoia, this obsession with traitors and so on, that you're seeing now. One other thing, by the way, I'd mention is, in addition to the EU, George Galloway, of course, who's something of a gadfly. He was on the extreme left of the Labour Party. He was kicked out of the Labour Party, and now he's just kind of, he's an anti-war figure, very much an anti-war figure, with supporters on the left and the right. And, he was just basically detained at Gatwick Airport.
Yeah.
And I believe he's fled the country, because I think that he's worried about being arrested or just not being allowed to travel. And so you're getting a very similar treatment to George Galloway outside the EU as well.
No, I mean, just to make it clear, we are at the point where people need to think about leaving the European Union and the UK. I mean, the Europe at this point, if you are a serious dissenting voice, is not safe for you anymore. So people are thinking about this actively, and I am glad I'm living in Japan because it gives me, it doesn't give me perfect protection, but it makes planning for contingencies a little bit more creative. I have a little bit more leeway, and actually Japan is not as on board with all of this as the others are, as the Europeans are. So, but seriously, we are at that point. And now the other side might say, "Oh, you're exaggerating. Come on, we're a democracy and everything is fine." It's like, no, my friends, it's not fine. This is not fine. By the very people who tell us that everything is fine and that they're protecting us, they're doing so with cracking down.
A big question I have is basically at some point within the next few months, it'll be obvious Russia's winning the war.
Yeah.
At some point, Ukraine will start to crack. The army will start to crack. I'm surprised they've held up as long as they have, and they certainly have been fighting very tenaciously, more so than I would have expected. But at some point, if you have this massive advantage in artillery and drones, as Russia clearly does, eventually the other army is going to crack. I mean, eventually the Confederacy cracked in the United States, the Wehrmacht cracked in Germany. It happens. And I think that's coming. And when that comes, I think the European elites and the American elites will have a lot of explaining to do to their populations. And that's going to be very awkward for them. Again, this could be very ugly if there's a recession. Things get very ugly indeed. And people will start asking, gee, I thought we were winning the war. I thought, Putin's about to be overthrown. I thought the Russian economy is about to implode. And when all of that proves to be false and people realize they've been lied to, I suspect it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly what the European elites are afraid of, and that's why they're lashing out.
Yeah, but you're seeing already like how this externalization of all of that incompetence is happening, with the talk about how China saved Russia, how everybody under the sun, including the North Koreans, are the ones who saved Russia, and then vice versa, of course, how the resolve of Ukraine was undermined by not giving them enough, by not doing enough, by having too many, Putin apologists who block further aid, and that's why we're losing. And that's, I mean, it's in a sense, it's as natural as war. It's as fighting in war, that on the home front, you then crack down on these dissenting voices, right? In a sense, it's very logical that this is happening.
Well, everything you said is true, but there could be some limits to it. And the model I'm thinking of is Vietnam.
Yeah.
I'm just old enough to remember Vietnam. And what I remember was basically that everybody supported the war pretty much in the United States. Everybody believed the lies, until basically the war was clearly being lost. And then basically Daniel Ellsberg published got the Pentagon Papers, which showed that everything was based on a pack of lies. And you had a collapse of public confidence in the government and all institutions of the government. Not just the president, Johnson and Nixon, but the presidency, the CIA, the FBI, the military, all of them had a collapse of public confidence. The credibility gap, it was called, it had a name. And a whole generation of foreign policy makers couldn't get jobs. They were despised by the public. Nobody wanted to talk to them. Some of them, Robert McNamara, elaborately apologized, effusively apologized. And I'm wondering basically if something like that could happen here with the Ukraine war, that this would be such a colossal disaster. Once basically it's clear that it's not playing out the way elites said it would play out, people could start realizing, I've been lied to, just like we were lied to in Vietnam. And that could lead to a collapse of public confidence in institutions, which are already very weak, as I said. And again, if Vietnam took place, fortunately for elites, at a time when the economy is growing rapidly, that's not happening now.
No.
And so that cushion won't be there. And so I'm just wondering if we could be in for some political instability in Europe. And in the United States, we already have the political instability. I suspect in the United States, we're on the verge of some kind of violence. There are a lot of guns here, including a lot of automatic weapons. People shouldn't ever forget that detail. And so things could get violent here in a way it would not be in Europe. But in Europe, they could nevertheless have mass street demonstrations, as France has had repeatedly. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. The scenario I'm presenting, what's your take on it?
No, it's just, we are all just trying to make sense of this. And of course, like going to history and to these cases makes good sense. As historians, we then know that each case works out differently, but there are the parallels to these others, right? The thing that I'm worried about is that something like Vietnam, I mean, which in this sense, the way that Vietnam War then led internally to kind of a mea culpa moment and the realization there was a lie, I think that prerequisites that not enough people were involved in it in the beginning and could say like, oh my God, I was lied to, I believed the wrong thing. But just think about Corona and how the buy-in into Corona and the buy-in into this entire narrative of the vaccine is safe and effective, once it was over, is now leading to an entire long period, and the period will continue, I believe, of just ignoring it. It's like we don't talk about it anymore. We just ignore, including in the European Union, that there's still this question, like what happened with these WhatsApp messages of von der Leyen? What is the entire corruption process that was involved into procuring all of these doses of things that still need tons and tons of.
Well, there's also the lab leak issue of lab leak. That's a very sensitive topic.
And all of that is currently being ignored because there was so much buy-in into the entire narrative. And in my view, the Europeans have at least a large part of the public. I would say well above 50%, maybe around 65% have bought into this and have kind of also like emotionally supported the approach. So actually doing a mea culpa would mean that many people would have to do it, which in my view will then rather lead to, we can talk about this. Just like in Germany, I had this interesting discussion the other day. The Germans were able to do a mea culpa on the Holocaust. They never did it with the 27 million dead Soviets.
Right.
No, and Warsaw, mea culpa, like Willy Brandt in Warsaw, it was toward the Poles. It wasn't toward the Soviets. So this guilt is so large, and there was so much buy-in that the best we can expect is kind of a long decades of silence on it. At worst, it will of course lead to the next crackdown, as just like how losing the First World War to the Germans is a major reason for the buy-in into going again into militarization in the 30s.
Sure. Well, I think that one of the positives I would say is that, again, when I was, in my younger days, there basically, if you didn't get into the New York Times or into the major networks, you had no outlet. You couldn't speak to people. Right. Whereas now, well, there are shows like this, for example, people can watch, and people getting in an alternative view. That option just didn't exist, let's say, 30 plus years ago, and it does exist now. I think that's very significant. You have, I have very mixed feelings about the guy, but Tucker Carlson, obviously, can have people like George Galloway on, and so you will hear alternative platforms. And he has enormous viewership, and he has some dodgy people on too, I would say, but nevertheless, and so I think that's a difference here, and yeah, by the way, during Vietnam, one other thing was that they did try to use McCarthyism during Vietnam. And if you basically said that, the Viet Cong basically represent the will of the people of Vietnam to some extent, and there's evidence for this, people try to call you a communist. It didn't really work anymore, was the point. I remember George McGovern, who was the Democratic nominee for president in 1972 very badly. He was accused of being, an agent of North Vietnam. It didn't really work that well. I mean, he lost the presidency anyway, but he had a platform. People, the lies of the McCarthy period have been so discredited. They've been so extreme that they just didn't work anymore. And I'm just wondering if people continue to tell lies, eventually they do catch up with you. And again, maybe that's too optimistic. And I'm trying to swear off wishful thinking because that's always, it hasn't gone well in the past when I've done that. But my view of history is that lying will only get you so far. And eventually, when the truth is staring you in the face, like, for example, if Russia flat out wins the war they weren't supposed to win, that could be very discrediting.
No, you're absolutely right, and I'm also very much opposed to nihilism or like pure pessimism and say like everything will end up in a nuclear holocaust anyway. I mean that's not helpful. It's possibility, but it's not a helpful way of thinking. So rather, like we have all of these instances. We are not the first ones to go through this. This has happened in other times, and then the question is like, what kind of dynamics are we going through? I mean, I think also of Romania, right? The point is like Ceausescu thought he was popular until basically a day before they shot him. Until the riots, you could see the shock in his face when suddenly the masses in Bucharest, they were booing and not applauding, and he couldn't believe it. He had to be flown out with a helicopter, but so these things also then tend to generate bubbles within the elite circles, and they can pop. So question is, are we close to a popping moment? Or is the bubble just going to enlarge itself and engulf even more people that then keeps it going?
Well, my guess is it's going to pop. I just don't see how it can keep going. The problem is you do have elections. At least at some level, you have elections, and what you're seeing. I'm not a big fan of any of these parties, but you're seeing the rise of right-wing parties. The AfD in Germany is now equal to the Christian Democrats, the National Front in France, the Reform Party in Britain, and of course Donald Trump in the United States. These, I think, are reactions to a public perception that they've been lied to, and they've been the existing political establishment. The anti-system parties is what they are.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Anti-system politics is what we have here. And I think this is only likely to grow. I don't see this abating at all. I think quite the contrary.
Yeah. No, the question then is, are the forces that are working, and I'm not talking about people in a shadowy little room, I'm talking about the sociological mechanisms, are they able to then co-opt these parties and kind of change them into
Good question. Good question.
regime parties? I mean, just like the Greens. The Greens in Germany used to be anti-war, and they were switched, right? And you can see how there's people in Germany who will tell you that the AfD on the national level has already been basically co-opted into this mainstream way when it comes to the war.
That's interesting.
You on the subnational level, on the local level, you still find very strong anti-war figures, but on the national one, people told me the AfD is already kind of on board with them with being acceptable to the establishment. And at the end of the day, that's also sociologically what parties need to become. They need to become able to be in a coalition in order then to govern, right? So that's what would naturally happen.
Well, they have to accede to the elite structure to some extent just to govern, is what it comes down to. And the elite structure is it is like the permanent government, the secret state, whatever you want to call it. It's there. One of the figures I really had a lot of high hopes for, and I thought was very talented, was Sarah Wagenknecht.
Yeah.
I'm very surprised she hasn't done better at the polls than she's done. I think she missed getting into the Bundestag by 0.1%. I thought that was tragic.
Yeah, I mean, she still says they need a recount of the votes, and the sitting committee is denying that because they're saying it all takes time, and we need time to review. So probably she had the votes, but even so, if she did, it was by a narrow margin, which is 5%, right? But then again, it's a new party that split off of an old one that wasn't much more popular than what she was. So it was a significant gain. Problem is now, of course, also that on the left, not everybody agrees. No, I mean, not everybody agrees with the with policies, the lefty policies that she has. So I mean, it's kind of a niche, but a very important anti-war niche, and that unfortunately didn't make it then into the Bundestag. But it's the nature of the anti-war people, right? They're segmented, they're fractured into different parties and so on. Therefore,
clearly, yeah, that's a problem. It's a real problem. I was hoping they would coalesce under her, but that hasn't happened on a large scale. I had some hopes that basically George Galloway could do something very similar in Britain, but again, it's very hard to break through this fact that doesn't really have an organized party behind him. So you don't really have a good, a good anti-war voice at the political level in Europe, nor in the United States. Neither party fits that bill. I think honestly, Donald Trump is a very strange figure. On the one hand, he's incredibly belligerent. What he's doing in Venezuela is, blowing up boats and killing people randomly in the Caribbean is incredible. His continued support to Israel, no matter what it does, is there. But I sense that he really was inclined to wanting to wind down the Ukraine war,
Yeah.
but he's under so much pressure from the establishment. Problem with Trump is that for all of his bravado, he's actually not very tough, is my sense of things. And he
Yeah.
responds to pressure.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, he strikes me as a classic bully, but a classic bully who's against world war. I think that's the kind of war he doesn't want. He's not against killing the little people. It's just the intimidation tactics, right? And that's not the problem. Is not not killing. It's like no world war. But the sad part is that in the current circumstance, it's not even bad. It's like, it could be worse. That's
Let me ask you actually about Japan, if you don't mind. A question I have about Japan is that, my understanding basically is the new prime minister, um, what's her name? Takaishi. Takaishi. She's, a hardline militarist, an admirer of Margaret Thatcher as well. And she is raising military spending. The obvious question is Japan is an archipelago. It's a series of islands. Russia and China, I mean, it's very hard to invade islands, is what it comes down to. And in military history, there's something called the stopping power of water, okay? That it's very, very difficult to invade by sea. And so Japan basically has nothing to worry about, even in theory, with regard to its security. Why are they spending money on military expansion?
Yes and no. I mean, I said this in shows of other people, but you must never underestimate the fear the Japanese have of missiles. The North Koreans, missiles. The Japanese are really, really scared of the missiles of North Korea. Really scared, to the point where in 2015 I was doing my PhD, and the North Koreans launched the first missile test across the Japanese archipelago. And that was such a huge thing. It was huge. It was huge to the point where my university wrote us an email saying, like, it is announced that North Korea will test a missile. In the case that the missile breaks apart above Japan, debris might fall on Tokyo. If you find missile debris, don't touch it. Alert the authorities. It's like, this is insane, right? It's an insane level of thing, but that's just how scared, like, even the ordinary citizen in Japan is of North Korean missiles. And that it's not expanded to China that much, but North Korea. And militarists can use that, although I would say there is a serious fear of this one. Also, that is then reflected in the way that they are investing into HIMARS system and anti-missile systems. And now that it shows how this fails in the case of Israel, in the case of Ukraine, in the case of Iran, right? I mean, this insecurity only deepens. So in a sense, this makes then the vulnerability of the Japanese, not from an invasion, but from mass destruction. I mean, Tokyo just boom, blown up, right? 15 million dead in an instant. That's the kind of fear they have.
It seems irrational, though, just because they're spending also a lot of money on things like aircraft carriers and so on. And that's going to do nothing about the missile problem. I mean, the missile problem is probably insoluble.
Yeah. I mean, then there's downstream, of course, other things like the sea lanes of communication, like the islands. I mean, Japan needs to invest in this, but they try to do that on various levels, including, and I find that good, on the coast guards, because the coast guards are a policing force, not a military force. They have various levels of trying to somehow deal with their vulnerable sea lanes.
So much of what this involves basically is a series of hypotheticals, what if scenarios. And it involves basically, this could happen, that could happen. Hypothetically, I suppose anything could happen. Aliens from outer space could attack us. Who knows? It's always possible. And so
but you find, I mean, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those were the bombs, right? That they eradicated cities that have burned themselves into the collective memory. And the sea lanes of communication, actually, the Americans again, when Perry came to Japan in 1854, the Black Ships. In popular narrative, it's like, oh, he threatened Tokyo, that he would bomb the city or Yokohama and so on, right? No. He threatened to sink ships. And the Japanese trade had to be done, internal trade, via the sea lanes. So threatening the sea lanes is like threatening, starvation. And that's what cracked Japan open. And, the people actually under whom I studied, they say so. And they advise the prime ministers. So this is
a little bit like
relevant.
Richard Cheney, during the War on Terror, coined the term the 1% doctrine. He said, if there's a 1% chance a country might attack us, we should treat it like 100%. and prepare accordingly. And he was ridiculed for that, but you could say that's exactly what everyone's doing. You could say that's what Japan is doing.
Yeah.
What if they shut down sea lines of communication? Well, what are the odds of that? Not that high, but let's treat it like it's a certainty and prepare accordingly. It's remarkable how this only applies to military threats. I mean, one example is basically if you look at, let's say, the COVID pandemic in my country, the United States, it killed 1.2 million people. That's about as many people have been killed in all the wars America's fought in its entire history. And for some reason, people didn't see that as the same as a military threat. And well, how much are we spending to prevent future pandemics? The tiny, tiny percentage of what we're spending on military. It's, in other words, there are all sorts of threats that are out there. Um, and the military is only one. And so you take hypothetical threats, you elevate them into near certainties. And you create a boogeyman, and then you throw massive amounts of money at them, and then you ignore all these other threats that are more serious, like pandemics or climate change. It's a kind of a curious situation.
Yeah, and in the process, you of course wreck the very thing that you're intending to protect, which is what brings us back to the European Union, which is currently wrecking its own values and democratic systems under the guise of trying to save it from the.
They're doing that, and they're also wrecking their economies, especially Germany, and far more effectively than the Russians are doing. They're doing it themselves by all these sanctions. I mean, deindustrialization in Germany because they lack the fuel to remain an industrial power. That's a serious problem, but they're doing that themselves.
Yep, they're doing it themselves. David, thank you. This was a very interesting discussion, and thank you for all the parallels that we could kind of try to develop here. People who want to read more from you, they should go where?
On my website, it's at dgibbs.arizona.edu.
I'll put it into the description of the video below. Anything to add?
And that's about it. I think it was a good conversation. Thank you.
David Gibbs, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.